Hello, my name is Taehoon. I'm an 11th grader in Cheongshim International Academy, and I am the member of the We Learn to Share project. So, over the next few months and weeks and classes, what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing knowledge about the SAT reading passage, how to solve them, the basic concepts, and moreover, after we finish the SAT reading passages and their concepts, we're going to move on to the AP Lang test, which is a step up and a gradually higher level test than the SAT. So, for the first few weeks, we're going to learn about the SAT practice test. I'll be sharing knowledge about the SAT reading practice test and how to solve the passages and their basic concepts with this 2015 SAT practice test 1. For this test, you can always Google it or search it, but we will just putting the links in the description so you guys can have the file. So this mock test is the main test that we're going to have the basis of our class with. So I'll be sharing knowledge of the SAT reading passage based on this text and the test. So while it is possible for any of you guys out there listening for you to just go along and finish this test as fast as you can, but I advise against so, as after you hear a few of my classes and after your concepts about the SAT reading has been a bit solidified, then I advise you to then go over the mock test and then just go over it as a whole with a timer, 65 minutes, and then we can go over it together as you reach our last steps of the SAT reading classes. So please keep that in mind. So this is the SAT practice test 1 in 2015. It's in College Board, but we will always be providing you with the files in the description, and we will also be providing the links and files for the answer sheet in the description too. So let's get started. So the SAT reading test composes of 52 questions in 5 passages, and you have to solve them in 65 minutes in case you aren't familiar with the SAT reading. So each passage contains about 10 to 11 questions, and you will have approximately 13 minutes per each passage since it is 5 passages as a whole, but I advise you to take less time than that because it will be always beneficial for you to have more time to revise or go over some questions that you aren't familiar or confident with. So today's class will be about the basic concepts or the concepts of the SAT reading test and how you guys can just be more familiar and you guys can make it more comfortable as you solve this test. So now I'll go over the basics. So as you said, 52 questions, 65 minutes. So the first passage, if there isn't a significant difference, will always be upon a fiction, a novel, or a story. So as you can see, the first passage here is from Lindy Minotoya, The Strangeness of Beauty. This is basically, I guess, about a fictional story or a novel based on Japan. So the first passage will always be a fiction, and sometimes and most times will be about in the 19th, 20th century written in the past. So you guys have to keep that in mind. The first passage will always be a fictional novel passage that has an fictional approach to writings, and some of you who have written a lot of who have written a lot of books will be familiar with some of the books as they use a lot of famous books too. So as you can see here, the first passage is basically about a person named Akira Chai, which you can see, it takes place in Japan and it's written in 1920. The setting is in 1920 and is written in 1999. So as you can see, most of the fictional passages are from the past. Some, if you're lucky, maybe from the 21st century, or like as you can see here, quite close to current day. But if you're unlucky, maybe from like 18th, 17th, 19th century, which is a bit more unfortunate since the passages get harder. So the first basic concept is the first passage is always a fiction story. So now the second passage or the third passage will be mostly on social science. So as you can see, money can't buy love. As I don't know what this word means, but it's basically about beliefs about gift prices and feelings of appreciation. It's basically about economics, social studies, social science, and psychology. These are the main abstracts of the second and third passages. They are mostly based on the social studies and their social sciences, and there's nothing too strain here. There's nothing too hard. The second and third passages are kind of like, they're both similar. They're covering very similar concepts, which is social psychology, and you guys can kind of go over these passages quite quicker than the other passages because they contain less challenging information than the other passages. So as you can see, the second passage is also social studies and social science passage. The third passage is a science passage. So I forgot to mention that the second passage and third passage both can be on a social science, but sometimes the third passages can be a pure science, which in this case, this is about DNA structure and X-ray, whatever that is. So the second and third passages, also the fifth passage is mostly based on the idea of social science or just straight up science. But mostly the second and third passage is social science, and the last passage is based on just plain science. But the structure of these passages can change or vary for each test, so you guys can keep that in mind. But the thing is, you guys don't need to have a lot of background information for science or social science or psychology, because this is just basically testing your ability, whether if you can interpret these passages. So you guys don't need to be worried if, oh, I don't have any basic knowledge about these kind of things. You don't have to worry about that. This is just basically testing your ability to interpret passages. So that's the third passage. And then probably the most challenging of all passages is the history passage, which is the fourth passage. So the history passage is probably the most challenging of all. It's mainly because of the situational, obviously, the situational setting of the passages. This is mostly based on the past 18th, 17th century or 19th. Here it is the 20th century. In this case, you're kind of lucky because it's relatively more in the present. But if you have a 17th, 18th, 19th century work, then I guess you're kind of screwed if you aren't familiar, not familiar to them. But however, these hard passages aren't always that challenging, as there are some easy passages that you have acquired some basic knowledge with. But assuming we don't have basic knowledge, then these kind of fourth history passages are very challenging. So the reason why these are so challenging is because just Old English itself is just confusing. It's just confusing to interpret it. You're not familiar with the words, and it's just hard to read and just go through these passages as a whole, because their structure is unlike you've ever seen before, unless you are some kind of crazy person who had a profession in reading 17th or 18th century works. So yes, naturally, the fourth passage is going to take the most time and be the most challenging. So I advise you to go to the second and third passages quickly, and then go to the fourth passage and spend more time here. So, and then the fifth passage, this is mostly social science or just science, as you can see. I think this is about robot science, which is just 3D printing, that kind of things, which goes into the category of plain science. So that's that. So just going over the whole passage as a whole. So if you just revise, the first passage is always a fiction, second passage, third passage, fifth passage is social science or just plain science or social psychology. And then the most challenging fourth passage is about the idea of historical letters or speeches or essays. So now we have just gone over the basics of the passages. We can now go on to the questions. So going on to the questions, the first question will mostly on each passage will be about what choice blah blah blah, or what choice best describes or best interprets or best recognizes what the passage is, or what happens in the passage. The first question will be asking you about what the passage is about, its structure, what's happening over here. So for example, in the fiction, the first question of passage 1 says what choice best describes what happens in the passage, is just basically saying that what have you learned, what have you acquired as seeing the passage in a whole. What is this passage about? That's almost the first question. Not just in this passage, but in passage 2, this is, oh yeah, this is a special case. The first question isn't always about the passage itself, but it can be about other questions, but mostly it's about the passage itself. So as you can see on the third passage, well, I'm getting nothing correct. So the second and third passage both not talks about the passage structure itself, but mostly it's about the passage structure. Yes, fine, over here. The fourth passage says here, the first question is, the central claim of the passage is that. So these kind of questions are most common in the first and fourth passage. And then in the fifth passage, yeah, no. So yeah, I have to make a correction. These kind of seeing a passage as a whole and describing their structure is mostly on the first and fourth passages. I think the social science and science passages are kind of off or weird, or maybe just I'm wrong. But anyway, this is the first type of question, just seeing the structure or the basics of the passage as a whole. So you need to have the ability to just know what's happening over here, what's happening, what's the author saying, how's the sequence of events, like the basic structure, and you have to see how to see the passage as a whole. That's your ability to solve this question here. And then this is also the developmental pattern. You have to see how the passage moves on or the structure of itself. So one important concept is you have to know the structure of the passage, how the argument or the main sequence of event goes. That's your basic ability. And it is your key tool for you to solve these questions. And then you can see here are the vocabulary questions. This is basically pointing out some vocabulary words and asking them what it means. So this is one kind of vocabulary questions. And then this is also another type of vocabulary question. It's basically saying about in the past, this word nearly means or used in a context of what. So there's no special tool in solving this question. You have to just know a lot of vocab and memorize them all, which is a tedious job, but I'm pretty sure it's going to help you in the future. And then we have the famous evidence matching question. So if you see question 4 and 5, it's basically says question 4 is asking a question and question 5 is saying which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question. You're going to see a lot of these questions in the future because this is one of the most common questions and a lot of questions and one of the most challenging questions in the passages. So this question is basically saying you have to solve this question and then move on to this question to see the evidence for the solution of this question. But you do not always have to go in this order. If you're unclear of the answer or the evidence on this question itself, then you can go on to the next question and go over through these lines to see if there's an evidence matching through all these answer choices. But we're going to do that in the next class. So yeah, just keep in mind that there is an evidence matching question which goes through 2 questions. So the reason why these questions are challenging is because if you get this one of them wrong, there's a high possibility that you're going to get the other one wrong. So that's 2, which is kind of a big loss. Yeah, you can also see here 9, 10 is also the similar category as question 4 and 5. So another question type is about the graphs. So this is a new type of question that was added in the new SAT. So in the social science or science passages, graphs or bar graphs or just other types of statistical measurements were added, of the statistical graphs were added. So you can actually see these kind of the result or the evidence of the studies here, but that's not really important. The important thing is you have to keep the last questions of the social science or science passages are mostly going to ask you about the interpretation of the graph itself. So you guys need to, first of all, you guys need to be in the mental state that you can actually look at this graph and get everything right in this answer question, because the graph questions aren't hard. You don't have to go over the passages or like look at some crazy sentence. You just have to look at the graph and with common sense solve these questions. So you guys have to be getting all of the graph questions well answered, because this is one of the most easiest questions in SAT. But sometimes there are some special cases where the interpretation of the passage itself and the graph needs to get matched. For these questions, it's more challenging because you have to interpret 2 things. So you guys have to be prepared for these questions too. So keep in mind that, first of all, keep in mind what the graph is telling you about, and then you have to match them with the passage's arguments or interpretation itself. So that's the graph questions. So as you can see, just going over, you can just see there's passage evidence matching, finding the evidence for this question itself in the passage. That's one other type of questions. You can see that there's a lot of question types I talked about. This is vocabulary plus interpretation. To see, you have to know what backbone means here and what this also means as in a role of the passage too. This is also a graph question. This is also a graph question, and this is one of the questions I talked earlier about how the interpretation of the graphs need to be matched with the interpretation of the passage too. So passage. So this is one of the questions we talked about, and this will be one of the challenging questions because you have to go over 2 kinds of interpretations, one with the passage and one with the graph. So this is a history question, and history questions are basically focusing about the structure and how the argument develops throughout the passage, because most history passages are arguing for something. That's what you have to know. Most history passages are arguing for something, and in most cases, something is minority rights, such as women voting rights or Black freedom, and a sequence, description of a sequence of events about some historical movement or a strike or a change. So that's what you guys have to know. And then you guys always need to know in history questions, is very important, what the author means or the author's purpose of writing this passage, because that is going to be the basis of the questions. So you guys always have to know what the author indicates or what the author implies or what the author means throughout the passage. That is the most important thing in the history passages, and getting them all correct. And yeah, this is why history passages are hard. Like, no one knows what sixpence means. I don't know what this means. I'm not sure. Even if I go through the passages, I'll know what this means. But they use some crazy kind of 17th century vocabulary that no one uses. So this is why history passages are hard. They're just using vocabulary that doesn't make sense or like seems too old and outdated. That's the reason why we have trouble interpreting. But as time flows and as you read more history passages, eventually you'll get the hang of it about these vocabularies too, and you'll like know how to move on and be like kind of correctly guess, which is a strange concept, but correctly guess like concepts you are not sure about or you don't get. So, oh yes. So one last concept before we end this class is about the dividing passages. So the division of passages can happen in any passages, but it's most common in science or history passages. So within this passage, the passage is divided by passage 1 and passage 2. So in most cases, passage 1 and passage 2 have differentiating ideas or beliefs. So I believe in this case, this is space mining, the next course. I believe the passage 1 is about supporting space mining, and passage 2 is about the advocates and the harms of space mining. So they have very differentiating or conflicting arguments. So basically, this is about them arguing against each other, whether it's a history or a science topic. So you have to know the relationship of these passages well, because in the questions, they'll be questioning you about how these passages like think about each other, how they reply to each other, refute to each other. Exactly. Here it says, which statement best describes the relationship between the two passages? The relationship between the two passages are very important in double passage sequences. So you have to be informed about this, the relationship between the passages too. So I think that will be it for the first class of today. We've just done a kind of a OT, kind of be orientation, introduction to the SAT basic reading. I've gone over some question concepts and the passage concepts, and I think this class have helped you about the understanding and kind of, helped you kind of be a bit closer to SAT reading. So from on next classes, we'll be going over passage to passage, solving each of the passages and kind of going over through the answer choices and confusing questions. So for people, you guys are always free to go over through all of the passages, but I advise you to just solve the first passages, and so we can go over that in the next class. So thank you for all listening, and I hope you guys all have a nice week or month or whatever. Thank you.